Hello everyone, this is again Bekir Fatih Meral, Department of Special Education of Sakarya University in Turkey exactly. Today I'm gonna talk about physical activities, especially what is the importance of the physical activities for children with intellectual disability, as well as the typically developing people. First of all, we have as a first part of our presentation, we need to talk about the definition, classification, or some characteristic of the intellectual disability. Let me share my slides, and then we can continue. Yeah. As I said before, this presentation or this chapter to be part of a European Union project. As you can see, on the slide, the first slide. Today, first I will talk about some things about the intellectual disabilities, and then passive physical activity. I hope so. After completing this slide, or if you will start to study these slides, you can define the physical activity or the assessment procedures. You can you can explain. Also, maybe some key issues you will know, and you will describe some characteristic of the intellectual disabilities. Uh, it's a very historical things there. I don't think so. We have a time to a deep historical roots of the intellectual disabilities, but we can say 150 years evidence-based practice is valid to by using the special education strategies. Yeah, maybe human beings, there were so many intellectually disabled people or individual with intellectual disabilities, but we can start at this period, the education of or scientific definition of diagnosis of the kids with intellectual disabilities or individual with disabilities, maybe end of the 18th centuries. For example, we can see some schools open in Europe, but mostly the growth rate of the intellectual disability or kind of intervention actually settled down to the United States. For example, 1829, the Perkins Institute opened end of the century. I hope so. I am sure I am correct. 1876, the Wynet Training School. This type of schools to providing the special education instruction, not just the habilitation or the calm down to these people. Yeah, there were so many tragic issues, when we see the historical, even the ancient Greeks, or Hellenistic period, but or scholastic age, but especially 150 years, we can say there are so many instructional strategies used for individual with intellectual disabilities. We can actually we can split the two periods. To the first periods to starting from the end of the 19th century to 1960s, 1970s, under the control of mostly professional, using the lens of the medical model, and then the social model of disability or social ecological or social environmental model of disability has been used by the professionals to understand or improve, develop some interventions. Is the medical model mostly try to understand the why anybody couldn't do the task, you know, and medical model explain the anybody's these disabilities as an individual issue, not environmental, not social issue. But then 1970s, since 1970s, the social model of the disabilities, the being at the how can I say the top paradigms over the special education, and then professional when try to explain the ability or disability issues to check the individual ability or disabilities. At the same time, they started to consider the environmental or social factors, especially peers, especially family. You know, the what's a person with disability or intellectual disability surrounded, you know, what kind of social environmental factors may affect the, you know, those kids' ability or disabilities. Let's talk about a little bit their yeah, there are so many things about to. Yeah, today, especially since 1970s, if we try to define the special education, actually we need to use the inclusive education initiative, because medical model mostly isolated the person with disabilities in the custodial institutions or nursery schools. There is no any integration, there is no any connection with peers or families. But especially in 1972 and the enaction of the IDEA 1975 in United States, the inclusion education initiative started, and this person with intellectual disabilities start to accept general education classes, and they have a chance integration with their normally or typically developing kids. This is a very big steps for in special education, also their life. In inclusion education practices, various arrangements and adaptation are made in line with the needs of individual with special needs in education and training process. In today, as I say before, you know, if we say something about the special education, it should be related to definitely inclusive education, because inclusive education is the best practice for children with intellectual disabilities as well as their peers, because it's a dual, it's a mutual issue, you know. Integration as society, or also social acceptance of the kids with disabilities by their typically developing peers, really important. Let's follow the text. In today's the inclusive education approach, the potential needs and interests of each individual are taken into consideration due to different disabilities or developmental characteristics. In this context, structured learning process centered on disadvantaged individual or groups are created for disadvantaged students groups to benefit from educational environment at the highest level and to achieve their potential. One of these groups is individuals with special needs. The reason for having special needs are explained as a genetic and hereditary metabolic disorder and condition. Those conditions negatively affect the brain or body development of individual. This can be, the postnatal or prenatal period. One of the important group among those people with special needs, intellectual disability. Historically, at the same time, intellectual disability now prevalence level 1% of world population. Think about the 8.5 billion people around the world, and the 1% of those people have an intellectual disability. Also, depending on the United Ministry of Education, depending on the IDA report, aged 321, I think the 2015 prevalence rate of the students with intellectual disabilities, 7% among the all disability groups. The most crowded group, the highest percentage of the disability group, learning disability, and then speech and language impairments, autism spectrum disorder, and 7% of the disability groups consist of the intellectual disabilities. We have as a professional, we have a organization, scientific organization, AAIDD, like APA, American Psychiatric Association. Our top organization, American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disability. So their classification, their definition, really important for us. Periodically, they published this book, the Intellectual Disability Definition, Classification, and the System of Support. This copy is 11th edition. 12th edition, I think they published 2021. So AIDD definition is valid and important definition. If you any scientific definition has to be made, we need to consider AIDD definition. Intellectual disability is a condition characterized by significant limitation in both intellectual functioning and adaptive behaviors that originates before the age of 22. This is the AID's 2021 definition. In some definition, this disability occurs before the age of 22. This means, the developmental period of the human life. So before the 22, any reason, any causes, the reasons, the intellectual disability. Intellectual functioning, you can see the two components of the definition of intellectual disability: intellectual functioning and the adaptive behaviors. Let's see what those means. Intellectual functioning refers to individual characteristics such as learning, intelligence, attention, memory, and perception. Mostly to assess the intellectual functioning, a professional use the intelligence test, such as Stanford Binet, Wiscar, Leiter, assist. There are some famous tests by using many countries, around the world. Social adaptation skills are practical, social, and conceptual skills that enable the individual to live independently, mostly related to personal, also social uh, relations, the connections, the life. Anybody's the ability arranging the personal issues, also the his or her social connection. Um, According to classification by AIDD, interpersonal communication, taking responsibility, obeying rules and laws, time management, social problem solving are listed among the main social skills. Practical skills can be listed as daily life skills such as nutrition, cleaning, and personal care. Skills for using tools and equipment for daily life, safety skills, and free activity skills. These third subheading conceptual skills include categorizing assets, having the money to control the money, literacy skills, and the manhandling skills. Social adaptation skill level of individual are evaluated with social adaptation skills. Um, Social adaptation or adaptation skills, for example, there are some skills can be used to assess them. Uh, for example, DABS, AIDD, adaptation behavior skills. What else? I remember the just two one. Sorry about that, but there are some adaptation behavior skills, that can be used to social adaptation of people with intellectual disability. The problem is mm, some countries, although using the intellectual test, such as Stanford or WISC or others, uh, they they don't use the adaptation behavior skills, unfortunately. This means the half of assessment of the intellectual ability. This is the missing part. If you comprehensively understand intellectual disability, professionals should use the both skills. Intellectual intelligence tests, also uh, adaptation test, social adaptation test, adaptive or assessing some skills, the adaptive behaviors. Yeah, Turkey also countries, some countries, the classification of the intellectual disabilities used to DSM criteria. For example, the APA DSM, in other names, because the American Secretary Association periodically published the DSM criteria. Last one they published in 2013 in May, the DSM-5, divided the four different part of the intellectual disability. First, and the 80% of intellectual disabilities uh, categorized or classified in this category mild disabilities, mild intellectual disabilities. This means the 50 IQ from the 50 to 69 indicate the mild intellectual disabilities. You can see that the 7.7 IQ like a borderline, like a borderline. These people live independently with minimal special education and additional supports. Most of daily living skills they can do without any support, but especially some cognition skills that they need a support, that they need extra work, or they need a support to providing by some professional or special education teachers or someone else. Moderate disabilities, between the 35 and the 49, these people needs intensive special education and additional support. Several 20 for 35 points, ranged between 20 and 35 points. These people require intensive and consistent level of special education and additional support, and profound, really high level, under the 20 point, 19 points, individual needs the lifelong care and the supervision. AI, they classified used different than the APA classification. They take into account the severity based on the intensity of support, because they mostly think about the environmental and the social connection, the surrounding the people with disability. They focus on not just the personal issue. They at the same time they focus on to the interrelationship between the society, especially the peer groups or family ability or family quality of life. So they using the instance of support classification. Each support identified is assigned one of 4 level of intensity. Intermittent means mild, limited means like a moderate, and extensive like a severe, and pervasive like a profound. Okay. Oh, sorry, this is sorry. Yeah, we already talked about the severity of disability. Okay. If we check the causes, reason of the intellectual disability, there are so many reasons, who can list. For example, prenatal causes, gene and chromosome anomalies, Down syndrome, Fragile X syndrome, problems functioning of metabolism, phenylketonuria, problems in brain development, hydrocephaly, the big head, maternal disease during the pregnancy, maternal malnutrition, unsupervised drug use during the pregnancy, alcohol, smoking, and the harmful substance use. Mother age is too young or too old. During the labor, because during the labor, delivering the baby. I'm talking about when they deliver the baby, oxygen deprivation of the baby at labor, premature or late labor, difficult and prolonged labor, brain injury due to improper intervention during labor, entanglement of the baby with the cord, low birth rate, one of the reason of the especially during the delivery. Postpartum causes, febrile illnesses child has, inadequate nutrition of the baby, accidents and traumas, iron deficiency, exposure to environmental pollution. Characteristic of intellectual disabilities. Individuals with intellectual disabilities may have different characteristics depending on their age or severity of disability or level of disability. Identifying the basic characteristics of individual with ID is very important in terms of early identification of those, direction them to appropriate education environment, and the organizing effective intervention and education program for them. The key issue is here the early diagnosis of intellectual disability and the starting in early childhood special education. It's the both of them so important, so important. Individuals with intellectual disabilities differ from their peers with their cognitive, social development, language, communication, health, and motor characters. It's totally dependent on the severity of disability. Okay, sometimes you cannot divide it. You cannot choose the which one is mild disability or typically developing kids. But especially teachers, especially class teachers, general education teachers, a couple of weeks later can understand there are some problems with this kid, dealing with this kid, and then maybe they oriented those kids to guidance and rehabilitation services to take the test and assessing what level of the intellectual disabilities. But ordinary people, especially most of the time, couldn't understand the differences between the mild-disability or typical developing peers. Individuals with intellectual disabilities are affected negative on their learning behavior and cognitive characteristic. Their learning is slow and difficult due to their sort of attention span. Poor memory skills negatively affect the retention, what is learned. In addition, they have difficulty in associating the new information they learn with their previous learning, generalizing and transferring what they have learned, and their learning motivation is quite low. Considering the learning characteristics of individuals with ID, more repetition is needed in learning due to their attention deficit and lack of motivation. Learning activities need to be presented in shorter segment compared to their peers. In addition, the learning environment should be free of distraction. If we do some, if we take some measurements and the result much more time and some extra practice with these kids, they can learn depending on yes their capacity, but definitely they can learn. They can learn. Their social characteristics of ID also different their peers. These individuals are slow learners and have lower perception compared to their peers. They have limitation communicating with environment, interacting, and social adaptation level lower than their typical peers. This badly affected their social adaptation or social integration skills as well. Due to depending on these problems, interaction on communication disabilities or inabilities, limitations, they cannot express themselves very well. Most of times, it's really hard to find the solution, the meeting to some problems. Therefore, they have lower self-confidence. At the same time, this affected their social relationship as well. Sometimes they represent some problematic behaviors. If kind of problems, they are seeing these problems, this means the decreasing the social acceptance of these kids by their peers, their typically developing peers or classmates. Also, these persons with ID, those persons with ID, exhibit different characteristics in terms of language and communication skills, may experience delay or difficulties using the expressive and receptive language skills. For example, typical developing is maybe starting the speaking, maybe 1.5 years old or 2 years old, but there can be some late maybe 3 years old or 4 years old or following periods. Some delays you can see for in kids with intellectual disabilities, especially delays in their language development, negative effect of their social development, their communication limitation, the kind of limitation in relation to communication skills, lead them to fail in school and social life. Also, poor vocabulary, frequent articulation and pronunciation errors in speech. So, some negative issues dealing with the speech and language they can experience, depending on their delaying the expressive or repetitive language skills. Health characteristic and motor developments, individuals with intellectual disabilities are also different. The likelihood of the how can I pronounce this word? It's really hard. Let's try it together, okay? Musculoskeletal disease. I'm not sure how an American or in British can pronounce it. I'm not sure. Disease or a disease condition increases in these individuals. As the level of disability increases, the same those words, the likelihood of musculoskeletal limitations and the secondary health problems combining the individual's intellectual disability increases. For instance, individuals with Down syndrome are more likely to suffer from the heart disease than the normal population. The presence of health problems and the increase in the use of the health services due to the problems interrupt their academic or social development. Yes, maybe this limitation observed with the fine or motor growth skills, depending on the motor development, the delays, they may have some problems, the movements, walking, running, staying, holding, the squeezing some things or using the scissors, when compared to their priests, they have some problems. They may have some problems. So, depending on the motor developmental delays, especially those kids has to be educated or has to be provided to, has to be supported by physical education or physical activity programs. So physical activities, exercise programs, and the physical therapy approach may be recommended to support the musculoskeletal system of individual with ID. So physical activities contribute to individuals' mental development as well as daily life routine and socialization. Yeah, this is correct. Physical activity is not just about our health or providing, the health or active life. For example, going to fitness center or playing basketball with our peers, going to swimming, it's like a socialization areas, we can meet new person or we can talk our friends. Physical activity is not just a personal or dealing with the body improvements. It's at the same time it's a social issue. Yeah, I think we can cut here. Yeah, we will talk about the second part of our presentation, physical activities and switch the intellectual with by switching the intellectual with the intellectual disabilities. Until the next presentation, see you then. Thank you so much.